My sister and threw my graduation cake on the floor and said, "Eat it off the ground." The whole table laughed. I did not say a word. That evening, Mom texted, "We have chosen to sever all contact, stay away forever." My sister liked it. I replied, removing my name from every loan tomorrow. By midnight, the group chat flooded. 152 missed calls. My name is Vanessa and I am 33 years old. After years of grueling late-night study sessions and working full-time, I finally passed my certified public accountant exams and earned my master's degree in forensic accounting. I thought passing those brutal exams would be the hardest hurdle of my life, but nothing could have prepared me for the devastating betrayal I experienced at my own celebration dinner. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who tried to tear you down. Growing up in our affluent suburban neighborhood outside of Chicago, I always felt like an outsider in my own home. My parents, Patricia and Richard, made it incredibly clear who held the title of the golden child. My younger sister, Brittany, was 30 years old and possessed a natural loud charisma that commanded every room she entered. While I was quiet and analytical, she was theatrical and demanding. She ran a boutique event planning business that looked incredibly glamorous and successful on her social media pages. She constantly posted photos of lavish floral arrangements and expensive champagne toasts. In reality, her business was constantly struggling, but my parents treated her like a brilliant entrepreneur. I was the reliable scapegoat. I was the one who balanced the checkbooks, the one who fixed the practical problems, the one whose quiet achievements were entirely ignored. To celebrate my new accounting license and my master's degree, I decided to treat my family to a nice dinner. I booked a reservation at a high-end steakhouse downtown. The restaurant featured dark mahogany wood paneling, dim ambient lighting, and crystal chandeliers that cast a warm, elegant glow over the crisp white tablecloths. It was the kind of place where the waiters wore pristine white jackets and moved silently across the thick carpets. I had saved up for months to afford this night. I wanted to treat my family to prime dry-aged steaks and expensive wine, hoping that just for one evening, they might actually look at me with a fraction of the pride they constantly showered upon my sister. I arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early to ensure the table was perfect. I wore a tailored navy blue dress that made me feel professional and confident. My parents arrived right on time, but they immediately began complaining. Patricia fussed about the valet parking taking too long, while Richard grumbled about the dim lighting making the menus too hard to read. They did not congratulate me when they sat down. Instead, my mother immediately asked where Brittany was. We waited for 45 minutes before my sister finally made her grand entrance. She swept into the quiet dining room, wearing a bright red designer jumpsuit, talking loudly on her cell phone. Trailing behind her was her 9-year-old son, Mason. Mason was notoriously spoiled. My parents and my sister treated him like a prince who could do no wrong. Whenever he misbehaved or threw a tantrum, they simply blamed the people around him for not accommodating his needs. Tonight was no different. Mason immediately climbed into the booth and started playing a loud, violent video game on his tablet with the volume turned all the way up. When I gently asked Brittany if she could ask him to turn the volume down so we could hear each other speak, she simply rolled her eyes. She told me I was being overly sensitive and that Mason had a long day at school, so he needed to unwind. My father chimed in and told me to stop nagging my nephew on what was supposed to be a happy occasion. I bit my tongue and signaled the waiter to bring the appetizers. The entire meal was an exercise in emotional endurance. I was paying for everything out of my own pocket, but my family treated me like an inconvenience at their table. When the waiter brought our expensive cuts of steak, Richard spent 10 minutes complaining that his medium-rare ribeye was slightly too pink. Brittany ordered 3 different expensive cocktails, taking one sip of each before sending them back and demanding the bartender try again. Every time I tried to steer the conversation toward my new forensic accounting credential or my recent graduation ceremony, Patricia would abruptly change the subject. She spent 20 minutes praising Brittany for booking a small local wedding, claiming her event planning business was the pride of the family. I sat there chewing my food silently, paying for their expensive wine and their premium side dishes while they completely ignored the reason we were gathered. I kept telling myself to just hold on until dessert. I had secretly coordinated with the restaurant staff to bring out a very special custom cake. I had paid a premium bakery $200 to design a beautiful three-tier vanilla bean cake. It was covered in smooth white fondant with delicate gold accents. On the very top, the baker had crafted a small fondant calculator and a tiny edible diploma to commemorate my hard work. I was so proud of that cake. I thought that when they saw it, they would finally have to acknowledge my accomplishment. The waiter cleared our dinner plates and the lights in our section dimmed slightly. I felt a surge of genuine excitement as two waiters approached our table carrying the magnificent cake. A single sparkler candle burned brightly at the top, casting a warm, flickering light over the beautiful gold decorations. Several other patrons in the restaurant turned to smile and clap politely as the waiters gently set the large ceramic cake tray down in the center of our table. For one fleeting second, I felt a sense of triumph. I looked at the little fondant diploma and felt the weight of those 5 long years of late-night studying finally pay off. Before the waiter could even step back, Mason dropped his tablet onto the table with a loud clatter. He scrambled up onto his knees in the leather booth, his eyes locked onto the cake. He reached his hand out, trying to grab the fondant calculator right off the top tier. I gently put my hand up to block his reach. I smiled at him and spoke in a very soft, calm voice. I said, "Wait just 1 minute. Mason, let me blow out the candle and take one quick picture first. Then I will cut you the very biggest piece, I promise." It was a completely reasonable request. But Mason was not used to hearing the word no. His face turned bright red, and he let out a piercing, high-pitched scream that echoed through the entire elegant dining room. People at the surrounding tables stopped eating and turned to stare at us. Brittany slammed her wine glass down on the table, spilling red wine onto the white linen. She glared at me with absolute fury. She snapped at me, saying, "Why do you always have to be such a controlling witch, Vanessa? Just give the boy a piece of cake. It is just sugar and flour. Stop making everything about you." I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to keep my voice steady as I replied that it was my graduation cake, and I just wanted one single photograph before it was cut. Mason did not care about my explanation. His scream grew louder, turning into a full-blown violent tantrum. He stood up completely on the booth seat. Before anyone could stop him, he lunged forward with both hands. He grabbed the edge of the heavy ceramic cake tray and violently yanked it toward himself. The movement was so sudden and aggressive that the entire three-tier cake toppled over. I watched in slow motion as the $200 masterpiece slid off the table. It crashed onto the hardwood floor with a sickening wet thud. The heavy ceramic tray shattered into sharp pieces. Thick white vanilla frosting and gold fondant splattered everywhere. Huge clumps of ruined cake coated the tips of my expensive suede shoes and the hem of my navy blue dress. The beautiful fondant diploma was crushed under the leg of the dining table. A heavy, shocked silence fell over the entire restaurant. The waiters froze. The surrounding diners stared in absolute disbelief at the ruined mess on the floor. I sat completely paralyzed, looking down at the destroyed symbol of my hard work. Mason stood on the booth looking down at the ruined cake. He did not look apologetic. He did not look scared. He pointed his sticky finger directly at me, and a cruel smirk spread across his young face. "Eat it off the ground," he commanded loudly. I slowly raised my eyes, looking past Mason to my sister and my parents. I waited for the scolding. I waited for Richard to demand Mason apologize. I waited for Patricia to express horror at her grandson's behavior. I waited for Brittany to offer to pay for the damages, or at least hand me a napkin to clean the frosting off my ruined shoes. Instead, a sound broke through the quiet dining room that shattered my heart into a million irreparable pieces. Patricia started to chuckle. She covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking with amusement. Richard let out a loud, booming laugh, leaning back in his chair, as if he had just witnessed the funniest comedy sketch of his life. Brittany openly grinned, wrapping her arm around Mason and kissing the top of his head. Patricia wiped a tear of laughter from her eye and looked at me across the table. She said, "Oh, Vanessa, do not sit there looking so dramatic. He is just a kid. You should not have provoked him over a silly piece of dessert. You really bring this negative energy upon yourself. They sat there laughing at me, while my graduation cake lay crushed in the dirt at my feet. I sat there listening to the sound of their laughter, bouncing off the dark wood-paneled walls of the steakhouse. It was a harsh, grating noise that completely drowned out the soft classical music playing in the background. My mother Patricia wiped her eyes and took another sip of her expensive red wine. She leaned across the table and told me to stop looking so miserable because it was bringing down the entire mood of the evening. She said I was always looking for a reason to play the victim, and that Mason was simply expressing his youthful energy. My father Richard nodded in agreement, cutting into his steak, without even glancing down at the ruined $200 cake by my shoes. Not a single one of them offered to help clean it up. Not a single one of them apologized for the destruction of my graduation surprise. Brittany was busy wiping a tiny speck of frosting off her designer jumpsuit, complaining loudly that the restaurant staff was taking too long to bring a mop. She completely ignored her son, who was now happily playing on his tablet again, completely unpunished for his behavior. In that exact moment, a profound sense of absolute clarity washed over me. For 33 years, I had been desperately trying to solve a puzzle that was inherently broken. I had believed that if I just worked harder, if I just achieved more, if I just became the perfect responsible daughter, they would finally look at me with the same adoration they gave to Brittany. I realized then that their lack of love had absolutely nothing to do with my worth. It had everything to do with their own toxic need to have a scapegoat. They needed me to be the punching bag so they could feel better about their own chaotic choices. A young waiter approached our table, his face pale with horror as he looked at the shattered ceramic tray and the smashed cake covering the floor. He stammered an apology, asking if anyone was hurt. I looked at him and offered a gentle, reassuring smile. I told him nobody was hurt, and I sincerely apologized for the mess my family had created. I asked him to please bring the check and a few extra napkins. My parents did not even pause their conversation. They were busy discussing Brittany and her upcoming event planning projects, completely unbothered by the spectacle they had just caused. When the leather bill folder arrived, I opened it quietly. The total came to $800. It included the premium dry-aged steaks, the multiple bottles of high-end wine that Brittany had ordered, and the expensive side dishes my father insisted upon. I did not sigh. I did not complain. I simply placed my corporate credit card inside the folder and handed it back to the waiter. I added a very generous cash tip to compensate the staff for the terrible mess on the floor. When the waiter returned the receipt, I signed my name with a steady hand. I gathered my purse and stood up from the leather booth. I looked at my mother, who was mid-sentence. I looked at my father, who was pouring another glass of wine. I looked at my sister, who was scrolling through her social media feed. None of them looked up at me. None of them acknowledged that I was standing. I turned my back on them and walked away. I did not say goodbye. I did not argue. I just walked out of the heavy glass doors of the steakhouse and stepped into the cool evening air. The valet brought my car around, and I drove home in complete silence. I did not turn on the radio. I just listened to the hum of the engine and the sound of my own steady breathing. The drive gave me time to process the magnitude of what had just happened. The final cord of obligation had been completely severed. I arrived at my apartment complex, a quiet, secure building that I loved. Walking into my clean, organized living space felt like stepping into a sanctuary. I took off my ruined suede shoes and placed them by the door. I changed out of my navy blue dress and put on my most comfortable clothes. I poured myself a glass of cold water and sat down at my kitchen island, opening my laptop to review some client files for my new accounting job. I felt surprisingly at peace. The constant anxiety that usually accompanied family dinners was completely gone. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed on the counter. The bright screen illuminated the dark kitchen. It was a notification from the family group chat. For a moment, I considered ignoring it entirely, but my forensic accountant brain told me to always review the evidence. I opened the message. It was a massive block of text from Patricia. She wrote that my cold and dramatic attitude at the restaurant had completely ruined what was supposed to be a lovely family dinner. She accused me of being a deeply jealous and negative person who could not handle seeing Brittany succeed as a mother and a business owner. She said I had intentionally made the waiter feel uncomfortable to make the family look bad. The text went on to say that my behavior was toxic and that they were tired of walking on eggshells around my fragile emotions. Then came the final crushing blow. Patricia typed that, for the sake of the family peace, they had chosen to sever all contact with me. She explicitly told me to stay away forever and not to expect any further invitations to family events until I sought professional help for my terrible attitude. I stared at the glowing screen. There was no sadness. There was no urge to cry or beg for forgiveness. I watched the screen update as Brittany liked the message. A tiny red heart appeared next to our mother's cruel words, confirming that my sister fully supported my banishment. They thought they were punishing me. They thought cutting me off would leave me devastated and begging for their approval. They completely forgot one very crucial detail about how their entire luxurious lifestyle was currently being funded. I walked into my home office and opened the locked fireproof filing cabinet beside my desk. I pulled out a thick, heavy binder labeled with Brittany's business name. Inside were the original loan documents, the mortgage agreements, and the lines of credit that I had signed 5 years ago. Back then, my parents had completely destroyed their own credit scores through reckless spending. When Brittany wanted to start her high-end event planning business and buy a massive 5-bedroom house in the suburbs, she could not secure a single loan. They had guilt-tripped me relentlessly, pleading with me to be the primary guarantor. Because I was the responsible daughter with a pristine credit score, the banks had eagerly approved the loans based entirely on my financial standing. They assumed I was just a naive, quiet girl who would sign the papers and forget about them. They forgot that I was a meticulous financial professional. When I agreed to co-sign those loans, I had my attorney draft a very specific, legally binding covenant. The agreement clearly stated that if they ever missed 2 consecutive payments, I retained the absolute legal right to withdraw my status as guarantor and trigger an immediate default on every single loan. For the past 6 months, Brittany had been secretly missing her payments. I had been quietly paying them out of my own pocket to protect my own credit score while gathering all the necessary documentation to build my case. I held all the cards. I controlled the foundation of their entire fake wealthy lifestyle, and they had just proudly announced in writing that they wanted me to stay away forever. I picked up my phone. I did not type out a long emotional paragraph defending myself. I did not demand an apology for the ruined cake or the cruel laughter. I kept my response perfectly professional and absolutely lethal. I typed a single sentence into the family group chat. Understood, removing my name from every loan tomorrow. I hit send. I did not wait to see the read receipts. I immediately went into my phone settings and switched the device to silent mode, blocking all notifications from the group chat and their individual numbers. I placed the phone face up on the kitchen counter and went to the bathroom to wash my face and brush my teeth. When I returned to the kitchen 10 minutes later, the screen of my phone was lit up like a strobe light. It was vibrating silently against the granite countertop. I stood there sipping my water and watching the notifications roll in one after another in rapid succession. Patricia was calling, then Richard was calling, then Brittany was calling. The group chat notification counter was climbing rapidly, passing 50, then 80, then 100 messages. They were panicking. The reality of my single sentence had crashed through their arrogant facade. They suddenly remembered that the beautiful house Brittany lived in, the corporate credit cards she used to buy designer clothes, and the business loans that kept them afloat were all entirely dependent on my signature. By midnight, the screen showed 152 missed calls. There were countless voicemails piling up in my inbox. I did not listen to a single one of them. I simply closed my laptop, turned off the kitchen lights, and walked into my bedroom. I pulled the warm blankets up over my shoulders and closed my eyes. For the first time in 33 years, I slept peacefully, knowing that the days of being their punching bag were officially over, and tomorrow the real consequences would begin. The morning sun streamed through the blinds of my bedroom, casting long, bright shadows across the hardwood floor. I woke up at exactly 6 o'clock, feeling more rested than I had in years. I reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen was completely filled with notifications. My mother had left 14 voicemails. My father had sent 30 text messages ranging from demanding to pleading. Brittany had attempted to call me 47 times. I did not open a single message or listen to a single voicemail. I calmly swiped the notifications away, leaving my screen completely clear. Today was not about their panic. Today was about execution. I went into the kitchen and brewed a strong cup of coffee. I moved with purpose. I showered and dressed in my sharpest charcoal suit. I needed to look exactly like the professional forensic accountant I was. I grabbed my briefcase and the heavy fireproof binder containing the financial documents. I walked out of my apartment complex and drove downtown to the financial district. The city traffic moved smoothly, and I arrived at the sleek glass high-rise building exactly 10 minutes early for my 8 o'clock appointment. I rode the elevator up to the 40th floor, stepping into the polished reception area of Sterling and Vance Legal Associates. The receptionist smiled and immediately ushered me into a large corner office. David was already sitting behind his expansive mahogany desk, reviewing a file. David was a senior partner specializing in corporate finance law. He was sharp, meticulous, and completely ruthless when it came to protecting his clients. We had been friends and professional colleagues for 3 years. He knew the broad strokes of my family dynamic, but today I was bringing him the entire ugly picture. "Good morning, Vanessa," David said, standing up and gesturing to the leather chair opposite his desk. "You sounded incredibly serious on the phone last night. I assume this means the situation with your sister has finally reached its breaking point." I sat down and placed the heavy binder directly on the center of his desk. I unclasped the metal latch and pushed it toward him. "It reached the breaking point last night, David. I am officially pulling the plug on everything. I want my name off the business line of credit and the residential mortgage immediately." David opened the binder and began carefully reviewing the original loan documents. He adjusted his glasses, leaning forward to inspect the signatures. I sat back and took a deep breath, ready to explain the absolute mess my family had created. 5 years ago, my parents faced complete financial ruin. Patricia and Richard had spent decades living far beyond their means to project an image of extreme wealth to their country club friends. They leased luxury cars they could not afford and took expensive European vacations while carrying massive amounts of credit card debt. When the economic downturn hit, their house of cards collapsed entirely. Their credit scores plummeted into the low 500s. They could not even qualify for a basic auto loan, let alone a commercial mortgage. At that exact same time, Brittany decided she wanted to launch a boutique high-end event planning business. She also decided she needed a sprawling 5-bedroom house in the suburbs to maintain the illusion of success for her prospective clients. When the banks took one look at her non-existent business plan and my parents' abysmal credit history, they laughed her out of the building. Nobody would lend them a single dime. That was when they turned their sights on me. I had just finished my undergraduate degree and had a pristine credit score. I lived frugally, saved diligently, and carried zero debt. Patricia and Richard subjected me to weeks of relentless emotional manipulation. They cried and begged. They told me that family always supports each other. They claimed Brittany had incredible business potential and just needed a small head start. They swore on their lives that they would handle every single payment, and that my name on the documents was merely a formality to satisfy the bank algorithms. I was younger then. I was still desperate for their love and approval. I wanted to be the hero who saved the family. So I agreed to co-sign the commercial line of credit for the business and act as the primary guarantor for the residential mortgage on Brittany's massive suburban home. But even back then, my analytical brain refused to sign away my financial future blindly. I refused to let them destroy my pristine credit score the way they had destroyed their own. David turned to the third tab in the binder and smiled grimly. "I remember reviewing these covenants for you, Vanessa. You insisted on inserting a very specific legal trapdoor into the guarantor agreement before you signed anything. Your parents and your sister were so desperate for the cash they signed the addendums without even reading the fine print." "That is correct," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "The legal covenant we drafted clearly states that my status as the primary guarantor is strictly contingent on Brittany maintaining a perfect payment history. If the primary borrower misses 2 consecutive monthly payments on either the business line of credit or the residential mortgage. I retain the unilateral legal right to withdraw my financial guarantee immediately. The clause explicitly states that upon my withdrawal, the bank holds the right to accelerate the loan, declaring the entire principal balance due immediately. David nodded, tapping his pen against the legal pad. And according to the recent ledgers you requested from the bank, she has violated the agreement. She has absolutely violated it, I confirmed. For the first 4 years, they managed to make the minimum payments. But over the last 6 months, Brittany's business started hemorrhaging money. She spent her revenue on expensive marketing photo shoots and personal luxury items instead of fulfilling her client obligations. 3 months ago, she completely missed the mortgage payment and the business loan payment. She missed them again the following month. David looked up from the documents, his eyebrows raised. But the bank never issued a default notice. How did you keep the loans in good standing? Because I paid them, I said, leaning forward. I knew that if the bank recorded a missed payment, my own credit score would take a massive hit. My entire professional career as a certified public accountant relies on me maintaining impeccable financial standing. I could not risk a default showing up on my background checks. So I quietly logged into the payment portals and paid the outstanding balances out of my own personal savings. I did not tell Brittany. I did not tell my parents. I just made the payments to protect myself while simultaneously gathering the banking records to prove she had failed to meet her legal obligations. Yao built an airtight case, David said, a hint of admiration in his voice. By making those payments directly from your accounts, rather than the business accounts, you created a documented paper trail proving the primary borrower defaulted on her responsibility. You protected your credit score while simultaneously activating the trapdoor in the guarantor covenant. Exactly, I replied. They thought I was just being a compliant silent partner. They assumed I was ignorant of their financial mismanagement. They had no idea I was receiving the monthly statements, reviewing the ledgers, and building a verifiable case of default. Last night they crossed the final line. They publicly humiliated me and then told me in writing to stay away from the family forever. I am simply granting their wish and taking my financial backing with me. David closed the binder and folded his hands on the desk. You understand the immediate consequences of what we are about to do, Vanessa. Once I file this withdrawal of guarantee with the bank, the fallout will be instantaneous. The bank knows that Brittany has no personal liquidity and your parents possess terrible credit. Without your pristine financial profile acting as a shield, the bank will immediately classify both the business line of credit and the residential mortgage as high-risk toxic debt. I want them to classify it as toxic debt, I stated firmly. I want my name completely scrubbed from their financial ecosystem. David pulled a thick stack of formal legal documents from his drawer. He placed them on the desk facing me. I drafted these notices of withdrawal last week when you first warned me about the missed payments. All I need is your signature on these 4 pages. Once you sign, I will personally courier these documents to the chief risk officer at the bank. I will also electronically file the notices with the commercial lending department. What is the exact timeline? I asked, picking up the heavy fountain pen David offered me. The bank algorithms move incredibly fast when a primary guarantor withdraws, David explained. By noon today, the automated systems will flag the accounts. By 1 o'clock this afternoon, the commercial lending department will freeze every single corporate credit card tied to Brittany's business. They will freeze the business checking accounts to prevent capital flight. By tomorrow morning, they will officially issue the notice of acceleration, demanding the entire mortgage balance be paid in full within 30 days. When she cannot pay it, they will initiate foreclosure proceedings on her suburban home. I listened to the timeline carefully. There was no hesitation in my mind. I thought about the crushed graduation cake on the restaurant floor. I thought about my mother laughing at my humiliation. I thought about the cruel text message telling me I was a jealous negative presence. They wanted the luxury lifestyle, but they treated the person funding it like dirt beneath their shoes. I uncapped the pen. I signed my full legal name on the first document. I turned the page and signed the second document. I initialed the third page and signed the final declaration of withdrawal. I handed the pen back to David and pushed the stack of papers across the mahogany desk. "It is done," I said. The heavy weight I had been carrying for 5 long years completely vanished. I felt an incredible surge of pure, unfiltered relief. David carefully collected the documents and placed them into a thick red legal folder. He sealed the folder and handed it to his paralegal, who had just stepped into the office. "Take this directly to the risk management department at First National Bank," David instructed her. "Hand it directly to the vice president of commercial lending." The paralegal nodded and swiftly exited the office, taking the foundation of my family's fake wealthy lifestyle with her. David turned back to me and smiled. "Well, Vanessa, the trapdoor has officially been opened. The bank will move aggressively to secure their assets. I strongly advise you to keep your phone on silent. Your family is going to experience a very rude financial awakening in about 4 hours, and they will inevitably try to blame you for the consequences of their own actions." "Let them try," I said, standing up from the leather chair. "I am a forensic accountant. Numbers do not lie, and contracts do not care about family drama. They wanted me to stay away forever. Now they get to afford their lifestyle without my money." I shook David's hand and walked out of the law firm feeling completely invincible. The morning air felt crisp and clean as I stepped onto the busy city sidewalk. I checked my phone one last time. There were now over 200 missed calls and frantic text messages demanding I respond to the group chat. I smiled, switched the phone completely off, and dropped it into my briefcase. The clock was ticking toward noon, and the financial dominoes were finally starting to fall. I walked into a small, upscale cafe down the street from David's office and ordered a matcha latte. I sat at a small marble table by the window, watching the city move around me. There was a profound stillness in my mind. For years, I had carried the invisible weight of my family's financial irresponsibility on my shoulders. I had scrutinized every bank statement, tracked every missed deadline, and absorbed every cruel insult just to keep their facade from crumbling. Now that weight was entirely gone. I enjoyed my drink without a single thought of guilt. At exactly 12:15 in the afternoon, the automated risk management software at First National Bank received the legally binding withdrawal notice David had filed. I knew exactly how their internal protocols operated. The system did not care about emotional pleas or golden child status. It only recognized risk and liability. The moment my pristine social security number was decoupled from Brittany's corporate accounts, the bank algorithms instantly recalculated her risk profile. The system flagged the massive debt-to-income ratio. It detected the missed payments I was no longer covering. Within seconds, the central server initiated a hard freeze on every single financial instrument tied to her event planning business. It was a cold, mechanical execution. Across town, in the wealthy suburban district of Oakbrook, Brittany was completely oblivious to the financial guillotine that had just dropped. She was currently holding court inside the opulent showroom of Maison de Fleurs, one of the most exclusive and expensive floral boutiques in the entire state. The showroom smelled heavily of imported orchids and expensive perfume. Brittany was standing at a massive glass counter surrounded by imported silk ribbons and towering crystal centerpieces. She was currently planning a high-profile charity gala for a local socialite, and she intended to use this event to catapult her struggling business into the elite upper echelon. She had not secured a proper deposit from her client yet, but that never mattered to her. She always just put the massive upfront costs on the corporate line of credit, knowing I would eventually clean up the mess if things went wrong. She was wearing a brand new designer trench coat and tapping her manicured fingernails impatiently against the glass counter. The owner of the boutique, a sophisticated French woman named Genevieve, was personally attending to her. Brittany was speaking to Genevieve with the haughty, condescending tone she reserved for service workers. She demanded 10 dozens of rare white peonies flown in directly from Holland. She insisted on renting 50 custom blown glass vases that cost $400 each. She added thousands of dollars worth of exotic cascading orchids to the invoice without even blinking. She was performing her favorite role, the wealthy, successful CEO who had endless capital at her fingertips. Genevieve patiently tallied the extravagant order on her tablet. Her professional smile never wavered even as Brittany rudely interrupted her to add more expensive items to the list. The total invoice came to an astounding $24,500. Brittany did not even flinch at the staggering number. She simply reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her platinum corporate credit card. The shiny piece of plastic was the absolute center of her identity. It represented the fake empire my parents had helped her build on my back. She tossed the platinum card onto the glass counter with a loud smack. She told Genevieve to run the charge and expedite the international shipping because she simply could not be bothered to wait for standard delivery. Genevieve picked up the card and inserted the chip into the sleek payment terminal. Brittany leaned against the counter, scrolling through her social media feed, checking the likes on the cruel group chat message our mother had sent the night before. She was completely confident. She had used this exact card hundreds of times to fund her lifestyle. The payment terminal beeped a sharp, flat tone. The screen flashed a bright red error message. Declined. Call issuing bank. Genevieve frowned slightly and removed the card. She apologized to Brittany, stating that there must be a slight connection error with the terminal. She wiped the chip on her apron and inserted the card a second time. Brittany let out a loud, exasperated sigh, rolling her eyes dramatically. She complained about how incredibly inconvenient retail technology could be and loudly reminded Genevieve that she was a premium client who expected seamless service. The terminal beeped again, the exact same sharp, flat tone. The screen flashed red once more. Declined. Do not honor. Genevieve looked up from the screen, her professional smile slipping just a fraction of an inch. She placed the card back onto the glass counter and politely informed Brittany that the bank was refusing to authorize the transaction. She softly suggested that Brittany might need to contact her financial institution to clear a fraud alert, considering the unusually high amount of the invoice. Brittany's face flushed a deep, angry red. She snatched the platinum card off the counter, defensive and instantly hostile. She raised her voice, accusing Genevieve of having faulty equipment. She aggressively insisted that her business account had a limitless ceiling and that the boutique was making a humiliating mistake. Two other wealthy clients browsing in the showroom turned their heads to watch the commotion. Brittany hated looking foolish in public more than anything else in the world. She angrily dug into her handbag again and pulled out her secondary corporate card. She slapped it onto the glass counter, demanding Genevieve run it immediately and manually bypass any ridiculous security glitches. Genevieve complied, maintaining her polite composure. She inserted the second card into the terminal. Beep, declined, account frozen. The blood completely drained from Brittany's face. The angry flush was instantly replaced by a sickly pale white. Her hands began to tremble slightly. She grabbed the second card and pulled out a third one. This was a standard business checking debit card. She shoved it toward Genevieve, her voice losing its arrogant edge and dropping into a frantic whisper. She begged Genevieve to try one more time, claiming she had just transferred $50,000 into that specific account yesterday. Genevieve ran the debit card. Beep. Insufficient funds. Account suspended. Brittany stood completely paralyzed in the middle of the fragrant floral showroom. The two wealthy clients who had been watching the scene unfold were now openly whispering to each other. Genevieve pushed the useless pieces of plastic back across the counter, her tone turning distinctively icy. She informed Brittany that they would not be able to process the floral order today and suggested she return when her financial matters were properly sorted out. It was a polite dismissal, but it cut through Brittany's ego like a sharpened blade. She grabbed her cards and shoved them haphazardly into her expensive handbag, dropping her car keys on the floor in her panicked haste. She scrambled to pick them up, her face burning with the most intense public humiliation she had ever experienced. She practically ran out of the boutique, the little bells on the glass door chiming a cheerful goodbye that mocked her devastating exit. She reached her luxury SUV in the parking lot and slammed the door shut, locking herself inside the quiet leather interior. Her breathing was shallow and erratic. She pulled out her smartphone, her hands shaking so violently she could barely type in her passcode. She opened her primary banking application, expecting to see a simple security alert or a minor administrative hold. She assumed it was just a temporary bureaucratic glitch, that a quick angry phone call to customer service would fix. The application loaded, revealing her financial dashboard. Brittany let out a choked, desperate gasp. Every single account balance was displayed in bright, glaring red font. Her business checking account showed a balance of negative $1,200. Her commercial line of credit was completely maxed out, showing a staggering outstanding balance of $140,000. But the most terrifying detail was the banner spanning the top of her screen. It read, "Account locked, default status. Initiated. Please contact Commercial Lending Department immediately." She frantically navigated to the account details page, trying to understand how this catastrophic failure had occurred. She scrolled down to the guarantor information section. The field where my name had sat for 5 long years, providing an impenetrable shield of financial security, was completely blank. My name had been entirely scrubbed from the system. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. The single text message I had sent the night before was not an empty, dramatic threat. I had not been bluffing. I had actually marched into a law firm and severed the financial lifeline that kept her entire fake empire afloat. She started the engine and drove straight toward my corporate office building. She was going to demand I fix this immediately. Brittany gripped the leather steering wheel of her SUV, weaving erratically through the dense downtown traffic. Her mind was a chaotic blur of panic and absolute fury. How dare Vanessa do this to her? After everything our parents said last night, I was supposed to crawl back and beg for forgiveness. Instead, I had orchestrated a brutal financial assassination. Brittany slammed on her brakes outside my corporate accounting firm. She aggressively mounted the curb, abandoning her massive vehicle in the middle of the executive drop-off zone, ignoring the angry blare of horns. She marched into the marble lobby. The lobby of my firm was designed to project absolute professional authority. The floors were polished Italian marble, echoing with the quiet hum of high-level business transactions. Brittany shattered that quiet elegance the moment her designer heels clicked aggressively against the stone floor. She bypassed the velvet rope indicating the visitor queue and marched directly up to the main reception desk. The head receptionist, a no-nonsense woman named Barbara, looked up with a polite but firm expression. Brittany slammed her hands flat on the polished granite counter, loudly demanding that Barbara call my office right this second. She announced she was my sister, and I was hiding like a coward. Barbara maintained her immaculate professional composure, calmly asking if Brittany had a scheduled appointment. This logical question pushed Brittany over the edge. She raised her voice, causing several executives near the elevators to turn and stare. She screamed she did not need an appointment to see her own sister and demanded Barbara pick up the phone immediately before she bypassed the security turnstiles herself. 30 floors above the chaos. I was sitting comfortably in my corner office, reviewing a quarterly tax projection for a corporate client. My desk phone chimed with a priority internal call. It was Barbara from the front desk. Her voice remained remarkably steady as she informed me that a highly agitated woman claiming to be my sister was causing a significant disturbance in the main lobby and threatening to breach the security gates. I did not panic. I did not feel a single ounce of anxiety. I simply took a sip of my sparkling water and looked at the large manila envelope sitting on the corner of my desk. I had prepared it an hour ago, knowing her arrival was an absolute certainty once the florist declined her cards. I spoke calmly into the receiver. I told Barbara that I sincerely apologized for the disruption. I explicitly instructed her not to grant my sister access to the elevators under any circumstances. I then asked Barbara to please signal the head of building security. I told her I had a specific document that needed to be delivered to the agitated visitor and that I would send my assistant down with it immediately. I hung up the phone and ran my hand over the smooth paper of the envelope. I had spent my entire life trying to avoid making a scene, trying to keep the peace, trying to protect my family from their own reckless behavior. Today I was stepping entirely out of the way and letting gravity do its job. I called my assistant into the office and handed him the sealed envelope. I gave him very specific instructions. He was to hand it directly to the head of building security. He was to tell the security chief to deliver it to the screaming woman in the lobby and then promptly escort her off the premises. Down in the lobby, Brittany's tantrum was escalating rapidly. She was pacing back and forth, furiously typing text messages to our mother, complaining that I was having her treated like a common criminal. Two security guards had already taken positions flanking the reception desk, their hands resting casually on their utility belts. They were simply waiting for the official order to remove her from the property. The elevator doors pinged open and my assistant stepped out. He handed the manila envelope directly to the imposing head of security. The security chief nodded, receiving the instructions. He approached Brittany, his posture radiating absolute authority. He held the envelope out toward her. Brittany snatched the envelope out of the security guard's hands with a scoff of triumph. She looked around at the watching executives with a smug, arrogant expression. She believed she had won. She assumed that by making a loud public scene, she had successfully intimidated me into submission. She genuinely thought the envelope contained a reinstated bank guarantee or a massive cashier's check to cover her daily expenses. She thought I was begging for a truce to stop the embarrassment. She ripped the top of the envelope open, tearing the paper in her haste. She pulled out the thick stack of crisp legal documents bearing the official letterhead of First National Bank. Her arrogant smile froze instantly. The document on top was not an apology. It was not a check. It was the official notice of default and demand for payment. The bold black letters at the top of the page commanded her immediate attention. She scanned the first paragraph and all the blood drained from her face. The bank formally acknowledged the withdrawal of my guarantor status. As a direct result, the bank was exercising its legal right to accelerate her commercial line of credit and her residential mortgage. The document clearly stated that the entire principal balance of both loans totaling nearly $1 million was now due in full within 30 business days. Brittany stumbled backward, bumping into the granite reception desk. Her hands shook violently, causing the heavy legal papers to rattle. She flipped to the second page, desperately looking for a loophole or a mistake. Instead, she found the asset seizure warning. The bank explicitly outlined that failure to remit the full balance within the 30-day window would result in the immediate foreclosure of her 5-bedroom suburban home and the liquidation of all business assets tied to her event planning company. She looked up at the security guard, her eyes wide with genuine terror. She demanded to see me. She started shouting that this was a massive misunderstanding and that her sister would never actually do this to her. She screamed that our parents would force me to fix this entire situation by tonight. The head of security did not flinch. He stepped closer to her, invading her personal space, just enough to establish physical dominance. He pointed toward the heavy glass revolving doors. He informed her in a low, booming voice that her business at this facility was officially concluded. He stated that if she did not exit the building of her own free will, he would be forced to physically escort her out and contact the local police department to issue a formal trespassing citation. Brittany looked around the lobby. The affluent business professionals she so desperately wanted to impress were all staring at her with blatant disgust. The receptionist was already picking up the phone to call the authorities. There was no mother here to coddle her. There was no father here to tell her she was the golden child. There was only the cold, hard reality of corporate security and a legally binding default notice. She crumpled the bank documents in her fist. Tears of profound humiliation and absolute panic streamed down her perfectly contoured face. She turned on her expensive designer heels and practically ran toward the exit, pushing through the heavy glass doors. She stumbled out onto the sidewalk, shivering in the cool breeze. A parking enforcement officer was already standing next to her illegally parked luxury SUV, writing out a massive citation for blocking the executive drop-off zone. Up in my high-rise office, I stood perfectly still by the massive floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the busy street below. I watched my sister aggressively snatch the yellow parking ticket off her windshield, crumbling it in her hand. I watched her frantically climb into the driver's seat of the expensive vehicle she could no longer afford to keep. She slammed the door with incredible force. I watched her speed away, disappearing completely into the dense morning city traffic. As her red taillights vanished around the city corner, I remained standing by the glass window. I took a cleansing breath, letting the quiet atmosphere of my professional sanctuary settle into my bones. I thought about the custom graduation cake completely destroyed on the floor of the steakhouse. I thought about the cruel group chat message telling me to stay away forever. They completely underestimated the sheer strength it took to carry their financial burdens for 5 long years. I was no longer the family scapegoat. I turned away from the window, walked back to my desk, and opened the next file. I spent the remainder of the afternoon completely focused on my corporate clients. The complex tax portfolios and quarterly projections required my undivided attention, and I gladly gave it to them. It was not until 5 o'clock, when the office began to empty out for the evening, that I finally reached into my briefcase and retrieved my smartphone. I pressed the power button and watched the screen illuminate the dimming room. The notification counter had skyrocketed past 300. The aggressive, hostile messages from the morning had completely vanished. In their place was a desperate, frantic barrage of emotional manipulation. I opened my voicemail inbox. There were 22 new messages. The first few were from my father, Richard. His voice started out demanding and arrogant. He ordered me to call the bank immediately and clear up whatever childish clerical error I had caused. By his fourth voicemail, his tone had drastically changed. The false authority had completely evaporated. He sounded out of breath and genuinely terrified. He begged me to pick up the phone, claiming that Brittany was having a panic attack and the bank was threatening to seize their primary assets. He reminded me that he was my father and that I owed him basic respect. I deleted his messages without a second thought. Then I listened to the voicemails from my mother, Patricia. This was where the true psychological warfare began. Patricia had spent her entire life perfecting the art of playing the victim. When anger and intimidation failed, she immediately weaponized her tears. Her first voicemail began with a loud, theatrical sob. "Vanessa, please pick up the phone," Patricia cried, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "I do not understand what is happening." Brittany came home completely devastated. "The bank is saying terrible things about foreclosure and default. You must have made a mistake with your paperwork. Please, sweetie, call us back so we can fix this together." I listened to the next message. The manipulation deepened. "Vanessa, you are breaking your mother's heart," Patricia sobbed. "How could you do this to your own sister? That text message I sent last night in the group chat was just a silly joke. You know how we play around in this family. We were all just laughing and blowing off steam after a long day. You are taking a silly little joke completely out of context and ruining our lives over it. Family sticks together, Vanessa. We have always stuck together. Please do not tear this family apart over a misunderstanding." A silly joke. I sat at my polished desk and shook my head at the absolute absurdity of her words. She actually believed she could erase decades of emotional abuse and a direct written ultimatum by simply calling it a silly joke. She assumed that if she cried hard enough and used the word family enough times, I would magically revert back to the compliant, obedient scapegoat I had always been. She genuinely thought I would jeopardize my pristine financial standing and reinstate $1 million of toxic debt just to stop her from crying. I played the final voicemail. Patricia was practically hyperventilating. "We will forgive you, Vanessa," she pleaded, offering a bizarre, twisted olive branch. "If you just call the bank right now and fix this massive mess, we will completely forgive you for the scene you caused at the steakhouse. We will welcome you back into the house. Mason misses his aunt. Brittany is willing to let this all go. Please just do the right thing." They were offering to forgive me. They were offering to let me resume paying for their luxurious lifestyle as if it were a grand privilege. The sheer delusion required to make such an offer was staggering. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel the familiar anxious urge to apologize and smooth things over. That version of Vanessa was dead. The woman sitting in the corner office was a highly trained forensic accountant who dealt exclusively in fax numbers and legally binding contracts. I opened my email client on my desktop computer. I downloaded every single voicemail, every frantic text message, and every missed call log from my phone. I bundled them into a single encrypted digital file. I created a new email addressed directly to my attorney, David. The subject line was simple: "Communication directive required." I typed a brief professional message. "David, please find." attached the recent communications from my family regarding the withdrawal of my guarantor status. As anticipated, they are utilizing aggressive emotional manipulation to coerce me into reinstating the loans. I refuse to engage with them. I am officially requesting that your firm issue a formal cease and desist directive to Richard, Patricia, and Brittany. From this moment forward, all communication regarding their financial crisis must be routed exclusively through your office. I hit send. Less than 5 minutes later, my desk phone rang. It was David. I received your email, Vanessa. David said, his voice brisk and highly professional. I listened to the first two voicemails. Your mother is quite the performer. I have already drafted the formal communication directive. It explicitly states that you will not entertain any personal contact regarding the defaulted loans. It informs them that any further attempts to harass you at your home or your place of employment will be treated as targeted harassment and met with immediate legal action. Thank you, David, I replied. Send it via certified mail and email it to their personal accounts. I want an undeniable paper trail showing they received the directive. Consider it done, David confirmed. You should know that Richard actually attempted to call my office about 20 minutes ago. He bypassed the receptionist and managed to get routed to my paralegal. He demanded to know how a lawyer could legally allow a daughter to make her parents homeless. My paralegal politely informed him that we do not represent him and terminated the call. They are grasping at straws, Vanessa. The bank is not giving them an inch. They will try to find a workaround, I warned him. They always do. They will try to secure secondary financing or leverage some other asset. They cannot comprehend a scenario where they actually have to face the consequences of their financial incompetence. Let them try, David replied smoothly. Without your credit score acting as their anchor, they are completely radioactive to any legitimate lending institution. Enjoy your evening, Vanessa. Turn your phone off again. My firm will handle the noise. I thanked him and hung up the phone. The silence in my office was beautiful. For the first time, I was completely insulated from their toxicity. I had placed a massive legal firewall between my peaceful life and their chaotic downfall. If Patricia wanted to sob, she could sob to David. If Richard wanted to demand respect, he could demand it from a paralegal who would simply hang up on him. I was completely unreachable. I packed my briefcase and left the office, heading out into the cool evening air. I decided to treat myself to a nice dinner. I walked to a quiet Italian restaurant a few blocks from my apartment. I sat at a small table by the window, ordered a glass of crisp white wine and a plate of fresh pasta. I did not have to worry about a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. I did not have to endure cruel insults masquerading as jokes. I simply enjoyed my meal in absolute peace. When I returned to my apartment, I felt a surge of productive energy. The immediate crisis of the bank default was actively being handled by David and the commercial lending department. However, my professional instincts told me that this entire situation was far from over. Patricia and Richard were desperate, and desperate people frequently make monumental mistakes. I knew I needed to completely finalize my exit from Brittany's business infrastructure. To do that properly, I needed to ensure I had absolutely zero lingering liability regarding her company operations. I went into my home office and opened my laptop. While my name was officially removed from the loan guarantees, I still possessed the administrative login credentials for the business banking portal. As a former guarantor, I was legally entitled to access the historical ledgers and transaction records up until the exact moment of my withdrawal. I wanted to download the final monthly statements for my own personal records. I needed to build a comprehensive archive just in case they attempted to drag me into a civil lawsuit down the road. I navigated to the banking website and entered my credentials. The dashboard loaded, confirmed that the accounts were locked and the lines of credit were entirely frozen. I clicked on the tab for historical statements and began downloading the PDF files one by one. I organized them into a secure folder on my encrypted hard drive. As I downloaded the documents, my eyes naturally scanned the itemized transaction logs from the past 6 months. It was a habit born from years of forensic accounting. I automatically looked for patterns, inconsistencies, and irregular cash flows. Initially, the ledgers showed exactly what I expected. Brittany had spent ridiculous amounts of money on luxury floral arrangements, premium catering services, and expensive promotional materials for events that never actually materialized. But as I dug deeper into the older statements going back 8 and 9 months, I noticed something highly unusual. There were multiple massive cash transfers being routed out of the primary business checking account. These transfers were not going to vendors. They were not going to payroll. They were not going to legitimate business expenses. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart rate picking up slightly. I opened a separate spreadsheet and began logging the unusual transactions. $10,000 transferred in October, $15,000 transferred in November, $22,000 transferred in January. Every single one of these massive withdrawals was labeled with vague, misleading descriptions like consulting fees and external marketing services. But the routing numbers attached to the destination accounts did not belong to any marketing firm. I recognized the routing sequence. It was a secondary offshore holding account. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. My family had not just been making poor business decisions, they had been actively hiding money. They were siphoning massive amounts of taxable business revenue out of the company and funneling it into private hidden accounts. I continued to scroll through the ledgers, my eyes widening with every new line item I uncovered. I had intended to simply download my final statements, but I had just stumbled into a financial conspiracy that went far beyond a simple loan default. I sat back in my chair staring at the screen. The desperate backpedal, the sobbing voicemails, the frantic pleas for me to fix the bank issue suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. They were not just afraid of losing the house. They were terrified that the bank default would trigger a deeper look into their finances. I was no longer just dealing with a toxic family. I was dealing with something much darker. My family thought they could use me, discard me, and leave me to take the fall for their crimes. They were about to learn exactly why you never frame a forensic accountant. I gathered my encrypted drives and placed them carefully into my briefcase. The financial dominoes were falling faster than they could possibly comprehend, and I was going to ensure they took the full force of the impact. I locked my apartment door and drove straight to David's office. The meeting with the defense attorney lasted 4 intense hours. We handed over every single encrypted flash drive. The attorneys immediately contacted the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service, arranging a preemptive proffer session. I was granted full whistleblower protections and complete immunity from any fallout regarding the fraudulent tax returns. The federal agents were quietly opening a massive case file before my family even finished their morning coffee. By the time I left the law firm late that afternoon, the legal firewall was completely impenetrable. I felt an immense sense of relief as I navigated through the busy downtown traffic. The trap was set and I was entirely insulated from the blast radius. I drove back to my apartment complex as the evening shadows began to stretch across the city. I swiped my keycard and descended down the concrete ramp into the secure underground parking garage. The subterranean space was cold and echoed with the sound of my tires against the pavement. The fluorescent overhead lights hummed with a low, steady buzz. I pulled into my designated parking spot right next to a massive concrete support pillar and turned off the engine. The garage was unusually quiet for a weekday evening. I gathered my briefcase containing the copies of the legal directives and stepped out of my vehicle. A dark figure stepped out from behind the concrete pillar, blocking my direct path to the elevator bay. My heart spiked for a fraction of a second before the flickering overhead light illuminated his face. It was my father. Richard had somehow bypassed the secure entry gates, likely by tailgating another resident's vehicle down the ramp before the heavy iron gates could close. He stood there blocking my way, wearing a wrinkled suit, looking frantic and dangerously unhinged. The polished, arrogant demeanor he usually carried at the country club was completely gone. His tie was loosened, his hair was disheveled, and his face was flushed with a mixture of rage and sheer panic. "Vanessa, we are going to fix this right now," Richard demanded, his voice echoing sharply off the concrete walls. He took a heavy step toward me, puffing out his chest in a classic display of physical intimidation. He had used this exact same tactic for decades to bully my mother and silence my complaints. But I was not a terrified child anymore. I stood my ground, gripping the handle of my briefcase. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. You are trespassing, Richard, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. You received the cease and desist directive from my attorney this morning. You need to leave this property immediately before I contact building security and have you arrested. I am your father and you will listen to me, he shouted, stepping even closer. You have no idea the absolute nightmare you have caused today. Brittany's business accounts are completely frozen. The bank vice president practically laughed in my face when I demanded they reinstate the lines of credit. Patricia has been sobbing uncontrollably for 6 hours. You are going to pull out your phone, call your lawyer, and reverse this ridiculous withdrawal right this second. Family loyalty overrides pieces of paper, Vanessa. You do not get to destroy your sister's life over a ruined piece of cake. It is not about the cake, I replied, my tone dropping into an icy calm. It is about the legal trapdoor you willingly signed 5 years ago. You defaulted on the loans. I withdrew my guarantee. The bank simply executed the terms of the contract. There is no reversal. The money is gone, and your fake wealthy lifestyle is officially over. Richard raised his hand, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. You ungrateful little witch, he spat, the venom practically dripping from his words. We gave you everything. We raised you. We provided for you. And the second you get a little bit of corporate power, you try to make your own family homeless. You are going to fix this loan default, or I swear to God, I will make sure your professional accounting career is destroyed. I will call the partners at your firm and tell them you are a vindictive, unstable liability. I looked at him with absolute disgust. The sheer audacity of his threats was almost laughable. He actually believed he still held the upper hand. He genuinely thought he could bully me back into submission. I decided it was time to drop the hammer and shatter his delusion permanently. Oakwood Educational Solutions, I said clearly and slowly. Richard's shaking finger froze in midair. The angry red flush on his face vanished in an instant, replaced by a sickly pale white. His breathing hitched loudly in the quiet garage. International client location scouting in the Maldives. I continued stepping forward and forcing him to step back. Offshore holding accounts registered through domestic shell companies. Phantom consulting fees used to siphon hundreds of thousands of dollars out of a failing event planning business and into your private untaxed reserves. Richard stumbled backward, his shoulder hitting the concrete pillar. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogant bully had been entirely replaced by a terrified, cornered criminal. He stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, realizing in real time that his deepest, darkest secrets were completely exposed. You really thought I was just a naive, silent partner? I asked, leaning closer to him. You thought you could use my pristine credit score to secure $1 million in commercial capital, and I would never bother to look at the ledgers. I am a forensic accountant, Richard. I track money for a living. I spent the entire night auditing the transaction logs from the past 3 years. I found every single fake invoice you created. I traced every single dollar you stole from the business to pay for Mason's private school tuition and your luxury vacations. Vanessa, please, Richard stammered, holding his hands up in a desperate, pleading gesture. His voice was barely a whisper. You do not understand. The business was struggling. We just needed to move some capital around to maintain liquidity. I was trying to provide for the family. I was going to put the money back. You have to believe me. I do not believe a single word that comes out of your mouth, I stated coldly. But the embezzlement is not even the worst part. You did not just steal money. You actively framed me to take the fall. I pulled up the federal corporate tax returns for the past 3 years. I saw the highly skilled forgery on the bottom line. You and Brittany deliberately forged my signature on federal tax documents to conceal your massive tax evasion scheme from the government. You set up your own daughter to go to federal prison so you could keep drinking champagne on yachts. Tears actually began to well in Richard's eyes. He looked pathetic, leaning against the concrete pillar, completely stripped of his power. I did not mean to hurt you, Vanessa, he begged. We were desperate. If the bank saw the real revenue numbers, they would have called the loans in years ago. We just needed to buy some time. Please, you cannot tell anyone about the tax returns. We will lose everything. They will send me to jail. Please, Vanessa, you are my daughter. You have to protect us. I already protected myself, I replied, adjusting the strap of my briefcase. I took the encrypted digital files, the offshore routing numbers, and the forged signature analysis directly to a federal defense attorney this morning. The Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service currently has full possession of your entire operational ledger. I was granted full whistleblower immunity. Richard let out a choked, agonizing gasp, sliding down the concrete pillar until he was practically kneeling on the garage floor. He clutched his chest, gasping for air as the reality of his impending destruction finally registered. "The bank foreclosing on Brittany's house is the absolute least of your problems now," I said, looking down at him with zero sympathy. "The federal government is coming for your freedom, Richard. Do not ever approach me again." I turned my back on my father and walked away. The sound of my heels echoed sharply through the parking garage. I swiped my keycard at the elevator bay and stepped inside, not bothering to look back at the broken man crying on the concrete floor. I spent the rest of the evening in the quiet comfort of my apartment, sipping herbal tea and watching the city lights. I knew the confrontation in the garage would push them into a state of absolute mindless panic. Desperate people facing federal prison do not make rational choices. They make wild, catastrophic mistakes. I went to bed knowing their next move would only dig their grave significantly deeper. The confirmation arrived at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning. My smartphone buzzed on the nightstand with an urgent notification from my premier credit monitoring service. I picked up the device and opened the secure application. The screen displayed a critical alert warning me that a hard credit inquiry had just been initiated using my social security number. The inquiry originated from a company called Apex Capital Bridge Lending. I sat up in bed staring at the alert. Apex Capital was a notoriously predatory private lender operating on the fringes of the financial sector. They were known for charging exorbitant illegal interest rates to desperate commercial clients who needed massive injections of liquid cash within 24 hours. They specialized in high-risk bridge loans that traditional banks would never touch. The pieces of their final desperate puzzle snapped together in my mind with crystal clarity. After Richard hyperventilating in the parking garage, he must have rushed straight back to Brittany's suburban house. He must have told Patricia and Brittany that I knew everything about the offshore accounts and the forged tax returns. He told them the IRS was already building a federal indictment. In their blind, terrified panic, sitting around the kitchen table in the middle of the night, they formulated one last disastrous plan. They believed that if they could somehow secure a massive injection of liquid cash immediately, they could quietly replace the stolen offshore funds. They thought they could pay off the defaulted First National Bank loans today, before the bank formally published the default notice to the national credit registries. They genuinely believed that replacing the money would somehow make the federal tax evasion charges disappear. But because their own credit scores were completely ruined, they could not secure a bridge loan on their own merit. Apex Capital demanded a guarantor with a flawless financial history to approve the high-risk transaction. My family did the only thing they knew how to do. Driven by absolute terror and breathtaking arrogance, they filled out the predatory loan application in the middle of the night. And to push the paperwork through the automated approval system, they secretly forged my signature as the primary guarantor one more time. They submitted the fraudulent application, assuming I would never find out until the money was already in their hands. They had no idea my proactive credit freeze was watching their every single move. The notification from my credit monitoring service blinked persistently on my computer screen. Apex Capital Bridge Lending. The sheer stupidity of their actions was almost difficult to process. I immediately clicked through the alert, navigating directly to the fraud dispute portal. Because I had initiated a proactive hard freeze on my entire credit profile the moment I removed my guarantor status. The predatory loan application was automatically flagged and halted before a single dollar could be disbursed. I requested a digital copy of the flagged commercial application from their fraud unit. Within 10 minutes, a secure encrypted file arrived in my inbox. I opened the document and stared at the final page. There it was, my forged signature scrawled across the digital contract. They were so blinded by their panic that they completely forgot modern lending institutions utilize advanced digital tracking. The application clearly displayed the exact IP address and the timestamp of the submission. It was routed directly from my parents' suburban home network at 3 in the morning. They had just handed me a brand new federal wire fraud charge wrapped in a neat digital bow. While I was exporting the Apex Capital documents, my personal phone began to vibrate violently against the desk. It was not my parents or my sister calling this time. It was an incoming barrage of messages from extended family members, high school acquaintances, and mutual friends. My Aunt Susan texted me calling me a heartless monster. A former college roommate sent a message asking how I could be so incredibly cruel to my own nephew. Confused by the sudden coordinated attack, I opened my social media accounts. The answer was plastered across the top of my feed. Brittany had gone live on Facebook and Instagram simultaneously. She had posted a highly edited 20-minute video performing the absolute role of a lifetime. In the dramatic video, she sat on the floor of Mason's lavish playroom, wearing absolutely no makeup and sobbing hysterically into the camera. She told her thousands of followers that her jealous, bitter sister was illegally attempting to steal her highly successful event planning business. She cried that I was trying to force a bank to foreclose on her home just to leave her innocent 9-year-old son sleeping on the streets. She completely omitted any mention of her massive financial default, the multiple missed payments, the illegal offshore money laundering scheme, or the forged federal tax returns. She painted a beautifully tragic, completely fabricated picture of a hardworking, devoted mother being utterly destroyed by a vindictive, childless sibling. The comment section was an absolute war zone of people demanding my head on a platter. My inbox flooded with death threats and hateful paragraphs from strangers who bought her performance completely. Extended family members who had not spoken to me in a decade were suddenly messaging me to express their utter disgust. I refused to let my family weaponize the public against me. I remained a ghost. I did not type a single letter. I took screenshots of her defamatory videos and forwarded them directly to my attorney. I logged out of all my social media platforms and deleted the applications from my phone entirely. I was not going to fight a battle in the comment section of a social media app. I was going to fight my battle in a federal building. I packed my briefcase with the newly acquired Apex Capital forgery documents, placing them right next to the comprehensive tax evasion dossier I had compiled the night before. I drove directly to the corporate headquarters of First National Bank, bypassing the commercial lending department entirely. I took the elevator straight to the executive floor and walked into the risk management and fraud division. Because I was the withdrawing guarantor on a $1 million defaulted portfolio, the senior fraud investigators were expecting me. I sat at a long glass conference table surrounded by 3 seasoned bank investigators and their corporate legal counsel. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I opened my briefcase and slid the thick folders across the table. I informed them that the primary borrower on their defaulted commercial line of credit had not just mismanaged their capital. I explicitly detailed how Brittany and Richard had utilized the bank's infrastructure to funnel money into offshore accounts. I provided them with the exact routing numbers, the fake vendor invoices, and the fraudulent ledger entries. The lead investigator, a stern man with decades of experience, opened the file and began reviewing the raw data. The color slowly drained from his face as he realized the sheer magnitude of the liability currently sitting on his bank's balance sheet. When I showed him the forged federal tax returns and the overnight attempt to secure predatory bridge lending from Apex Capital, using my stolen identity, the atmosphere in the room shifted from professional concern to absolute corporate emergency. The bank executives were not just dealing with a standard commercial default anymore. They were now dealing with a highly sophisticated money laundering operation that had successfully bypassed their internal anti-fraud algorithms for 3 consecutive years. The realization that their own institutional safeguards had failed so spectacularly made the executives visibly furious. Because my family had submitted a fraudulent credit application to Apex Capital overnight, they had triggered the bank's emergency breach of contract clauses. The bank now possessed the legal authority to accelerate the seizure of all physical collateral tied to the business. I signed the final release documents, completely severing myself from their corporate infrastructure. Leaving the bank, I drove straight to the federal building downtown to meet David. He was waiting for me in the expansive marble lobby, standing next to a highly respected federal defense attorney he had retained for my whistleblower protection. We cleared the strict federal security checkpoints and took the elevator up to the regional headquarters of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. We were ushered into a stark, windowless interrogation room. Two federal agents wearing dark suits and carrying thick legal notepads entered the room and sat across from us. They had already reviewed the preliminary data David had submitted that morning, but they needed my formal sworn statement to officially launch the full-scale federal audit. I spent the next 3 hours walking the federal agents through every single line item of my family's criminal enterprise. I explained how Richard established the domestic shell companies to generate fake invoices. I demonstrated exactly how Brittany siphoned the event planning revenue through those shell companies to pay for Mason's elite private school tuition and their luxury vacations to the Maldives. I handed over the digital metadata, proving they had forged my signature on the corporate tax returns from their home network. I gave them the Apex Capital loan application, proving they were actively committing ongoing wire fraud as recently as 3 o'clock this morning. The federal agents did not show any emotion, but they took meticulous notes analyzing every single piece of undeniable evidence I provided. The federal agents were particularly interested in the fraudulent tax returns. The lead agent explained that Richard and Brittany were not just looking at standard tax evasion penalties. They were looking at aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. He emphasized that my proactive actions and pristine documentation had saved me from being indicted alongside them. The federal prosecutors would use my forensic data to build an airtight criminal case against my father and sister, ensuring they could not negotiate their way out of a severe prison sentence. I answered every question with cold, analytical precision. There was no hesitation in my voice. There was no lingering loyalty to the parents who had laughed at my humiliation or the sister who had tried to destroy my future. The lead agent explicitly instructed me to maintain my absolute silence. He told me not to alert my family that the federal authorities were now actively investigating their entire criminal financial history. He explained that the IRS would immediately petition a federal judge for specialized warrants to freeze the offshore routing accounts and seize the domestic shell company assets. A full federal audit was now officially triggered. When the meeting finally concluded, I walked out of the federal building with David. The afternoon sun was shining brightly over the city plaza. The massive weight of the secret investigation was now entirely in the hands of the federal government. My family had spent their entire lives treating me like garbage. Now they were going to face the full crushing weight of the United States justice system. I stood on the sidewalk watching the busy downtown traffic flowing past the courthouse steps. There was no anxiety left in my body, only cold, calculated anticipation. They had stolen my signature to fund their greed, and now that very same signature had permanently sealed their fate. The days of me fixing their endless problems were over, and the era of severe, unyielding consequences had finally begun. The days following my meeting at the federal building were remarkably quiet. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that always precedes a massive storm. I continued going to my corporate accounting job, maintaining my daily routine with absolute precision. I drank my morning coffee, reviewed my client portfolios, and smiled politely at my coworkers. Nobody looking at me would ever suspect that I had just handed the federal government the blueprint to dismantle my entire family. While I sat in my peaceful corner office, my family was living in a state of absolute manufactured delusion. Through a combination of mutual contacts and public social media posts, I watched their false confidence inflate to catastrophic proportions. Brittany and my parents completely believed they had outsmarted me. They genuinely thought their midnight application to Apex Capital Bridge lending had been successfully processed. What they did not understand was how automated high-risk lending actually worked. When they submitted the forged application, the predatory lending portal likely generated an automated preliminary approval screen based purely on my stolen, pristine credit score. They saw the word approved on their computer monitor and immediately assumed the cash was as good as deposited. They were entirely unaware that my proactive credit freeze had intercepted the actual disbursement of funds, locking the money in a permanent administrative void. Operating under this massive delusion, they made the most disastrous financial decision of their entire lives. Believing that a massive wire transfer from Apex Capital was going to hit their accounts any day, they decided to completely drain the very last of their hidden offshore cash reserves. They transferred the remaining laundered money back into a domestic checking account under my mother's name. They did not use this money to pay off the defaulted commercial loans at First National Bank. They did not use it to save Brittany's suburban home from the impending foreclosure process. Their arrogance completely blinded their logic. Instead, they decided to double down on their fake wealthy lifestyle. Brittany convinced my parents that the only way to save her event planning business was to project an image of untouchable success. She conceptualized a massive, lavish event that she dubbed her corporate rebranding gala. The plan was to invite all the wealthiest socialites, potential corporate clients, and local influencers in the city. She wanted to throw a party so incredibly extravagant that nobody would ever believe the rumors about her financial collapse. She wanted to prove to the world, and more importantly to me, that she was an unstoppable self-made CEO who did not need my financial backing to thrive. They booked the grand ballroom at the Oak Brook Country Club, one of the most exclusive and expensive venues in the entire state. The required upfront deposit alone was astronomical, but Patricia gladly handed over a cashier's check, draining her personal accounts to fund her golden child's delusional comeback. I sat at my desk and watched the digital invitations circulate through the local business community. Several of my own corporate clients forwarded the digital flyers to me, asking if I was attending my sister's grand relaunch. The invitation featured elegant gold foil typography, promising an evening of premium champagne, exclusive networking, and a showcase of unparalleled luxury event design. Brittany went on an absolute spending rampage. She hired a team of private decorators to transform the country club ballroom into a floral wonderland. She ordered massive towering centerpieces made of imported white roses and rare orchids. She contracted a premium catering company to serve dry-aged beef and butter-poached lobster to over 200 anticipated guests. She rented custom velvet lounge furniture, premium silk table linens, and a state-of-the-art lighting system to illuminate the dance floor. She even commissioned a massive hand-carved ice sculpture of her new corporate logo to serve as the centerpiece of the cocktail reception. She was pouring tens of thousands of dollars into a single evening of vanity while the bank was actively drafting the final asset seizure documents for her business. Patricia and Richard were fully complicit in this magnificent display of financial suicide. They enabled her delusion because it protected their own fragile egos. Patricia spent her days at the luxury shopping district purchasing brand new designer evening gowns for herself and Brittany to wear to the gala. She posted photos of their shopping bags on social media with passive-aggressive captions about how real families support each other through thick and thin, and how toxic, jealous people will never succeed in bringing down true entrepreneurs. Richard was busy calling his old business contacts, bragging about his daughter's massive corporate expansion, and completely ignoring the fact that his fake vendor network was currently being dissected by federal forensic investigators. They were all dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, completely convinced they were flying. My phone rang late on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 2 days before Brittany's scheduled gala. It was my attorney, David. His voice was calm, but laced with intense professional satisfaction. Vanessa, David said clearly. I just received a confidential update from the corporate counsel at First National Bank. They have officially finalized the asset forfeiture paperwork. Because of the fraudulent Apex Capital application, you provided the bank executed the emergency breach of contract clauses. They are not waiting the standard 30 days for the commercial foreclosure. The Risk Management Division has authorized an immediate physical seizure of all corporate assets tied to your sister's event planning business. I leaned back in my leather chair, my eyes locked on the city skyline outside my window. What is their exact timeline, David? They are moving tomorrow evening, David replied. The bank has contracted a specialized corporate recovery agency. The recovery agents have the legal authority to seize any physical property, equipment, or capital inventory purchased under the defaulted commercial line of credit. They know about the country club, Gala Vanessa. They tracked the recent vendor payments. They know she has transported hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of company assets to that specific venue for the event. I felt a cold, sharp smile touch the corners of my mouth. They are going to seize the assets directly from the country club. Yes, David confirmed. The recovery agents are scheduled to arrive at the venue tomorrow night, right in the middle of the cocktail reception. But that is not the only development. The federal defense attorney contacted me an hour ago. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division has secured the necessary federal warrants. They have successfully frozen the offshore routing accounts and flagged the domestic shell companies. The federal agents are coordinating their strike with the bank recovery team. They are going to hit the gala simultaneously to serve Richard and Brittany with the formal federal indictment notices. The sheer perfection of the timing was staggering. Brittany had intentionally designed this gala to be the ultimate public display of her superiority. She had invited every important client, every wealthy investor, and every prominent socialite she knew to witness her triumph. She was going to receive her absolute destruction on the exact same stage she built for her victory. David paused for a moment before continuing. The lead bank investigator requested that you be present at the venue tomorrow night, Vanessa. Because you were the primary guarantor who initiated the default discovery, they need you to formally sign the final release of liability documents on site once the physical assets are officially seized. The federal agents also want you there to identify the specific individuals involved in the domestic shell company operations. I will personally accompany you to ensure your legal protections remain completely intact. I will be there, I said without a single ounce of hesitation. I hung up the phone and opened my laptop. I navigated to the digital invitation for the rebranding gala that a client had forwarded to me earlier in the week. The event was scheduled to begin at 7 o'clock tomorrow evening. The dress code was strictly black tie. Brittany was demanding that her guests dress in their absolute finest to witness her fake empire. I closed my laptop and packed my briefcase. I left the office early and drove to a high-end boutique downtown. I purchased a stunning floor-length emerald green evening gown. It was sharp, elegant, and commanded absolute authority. If my family wanted a dramatic theatrical production, I was going to give them an unforgettable finale. That night, I sat in my quiet apartment enjoying a glass of sparkling water. I thought about the cruel laughter at the steakhouse. I thought about Mason throwing my graduation cake onto the floor and demanding I eat it. I thought about my mother texting me to stay away forever. They had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, insignificant, and powerless. They had used my credit, stolen my signature, and attempted to leave me holding the bag for their federal crimes. They believed they had won. They were currently sleeping soundly in their suburban beds, dreaming about the expensive champagne they would drink tomorrow night. They were dreaming about the wealthy clients they would impress and the fake empire they would continue to build. They had no idea that the foundation of their entire existence had already been completely eradicated. They had no idea that the banks and the federal government were already marching toward their front door. I turned off the lights in my kitchen and walked into my bedroom. I felt an overwhelming sense of absolute tranquility. The storm was no longer approaching. The storm had already arrived, and it was about to wash away every single trace of their toxic, arrogant existence. Tomorrow night, I was going to walk into that country club, not as a scapegoat, not as a victim, and certainly not as a compliant daughter. I was going to walk into that ballroom as the architect of their total and complete ruin. I set my alarm, closed my eyes, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep ready for the reckoning. I woke up on Saturday morning with a profound sense of absolute clarity. The day of the Oak Brook Country Club Gala had finally arrived. I spent the early morning reviewing the final legal dossiers, making sure every single document was perfectly organized and secured in my briefcase. I drank my coffee and watched the city come to life below my apartment window. There was no anxiety left in my system. The emotional wounds that had plagued me for 33 years were completely gone, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of impending justice. By late afternoon, I began to prepare for the evening. I took my time getting ready. I slipped into the emerald green evening gown I had purchased earlier in the week. The heavy silk draped perfectly, projecting absolute authority and untouchable confidence. I swept my hair up into a sleek professional style and applied a sharp, bold red lipstick. I looked in the full-length mirror and recognized the woman staring back. She was not a victim. She was a forensic accountant about to execute the most flawless financial takedown in the history of our family. I drove to the Oak Brook Country Club as the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the pristine golf course. The venue was a massive sprawling estate, featuring white pillars and meticulously manicured gardens. The circular driveway was already packed with luxury vehicles and valet attendants rushing to open doors for the local elite. I bypassed the main valet line and pulled into a reserved executive parking space near the side entrance. David was already waiting for me by the stone fountain. He was dressed in a sharp black suit, carrying a thick leather briefcase containing the bank default notices and the asset seizure warrants. Standing next to him was a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark tactical suit. David introduced him as Special Agent Miller, the lead federal asset recovery coordinator, assigned by the bank and working in tandem with federal authorities. Agent Miller did not smile. He simply nodded, acknowledging that the operation was fully authorized and ready to commence. We stood outside the grand double doors of the ballroom, listening to the muffled sounds of classical music and clinking champagne glasses. The trap was fully set. We walked through the heavy oak doors and stepped into the grand ballroom. The sheer audacity of Brittany's spending was immediately apparent. The room had been transformed into a lavish floral wonderland, entirely funded by stolen money and fraudulent bridge loans. Massive towering centerpieces of imported white roses and rare orchids adorned every single table. A string quartet played softly in the corner, while waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with butter-poached lobster and expensive caviar. In the absolute center of the room sat a massive hand-carved ice sculpture of Brittany's new corporate logo, glittering under the state-of-the-art lighting system she had rented. It was a breathtaking display of financial suicide. The ballroom was packed with over 200 guests. I recognized prominent local real estate developers, wealthy socialites, and several of my own corporate clients. They were all sipping premium champagne, completely oblivious to the fact that they were attending an active crime scene. I scanned the room and quickly located my family holding court near the main bar. Brittany was wearing a custom beaded silver gown, laughing loudly, and waving her hands as she entertained a group of potential investors. She looked entirely too confident, convinced that her fake empire was secure. Richard stood nearby holding a glass of scotch, bragging to a local politician about his daughter's incredible business acumen. Patricia was floating between groups wearing a diamond necklace she had undoubtedly purchased with laundered funds. They were playing their roles perfectly, projecting an image of untouchable wealth and superiority. They were entirely wrapped in their delusion, believing they had outsmarted me with their forged predatory loan. I stepped forward into the main reception area, with David and Agent Miller flanking me on either side. My emerald green dress stood out sharply against the sea of muted black and white formal wear. I did not try to blend in. I walked with deliberate, measured steps, my head held high. As we moved deeper into the ballroom, the atmosphere began to shift. People noticed the sudden change in energy. The casual laughter near the entrance slowly died down, replaced by curious whispers. My corporate clients recognized me and offered confused but polite nods, wondering why their forensic accountant was crashing a socialite event, accompanied by men who looked distinctly like federal authorities. The ripple of silence spread across the room like a wave slowly making its way toward the main bar. Patricia was the first one to spot me. She was mid-sentence holding a crystal flute of champagne when her eyes locked onto mine. Her face instantly drained of color. The polite society smile froze on her lips, transforming into a mask of pure panic. She quickly recovered her composure, her features hardening into a furious glare. She whispered something to Richard, who snapped his head around to look at me. He nearly dropped his glass of scotch. Brittany turned around a second later, her arrogant laugh dying in her throat as she registered my presence. Patricia did not wait for me to reach them. She marched directly across the ballroom floor, her expensive heels clicking aggressively against the polished wood. She was absolutely determined to stop me before I could ruin their perfect public performance. Patricia intercepted us near the center of the dance floor, right next to the massive ice sculpture. She blocked our path, puffing out her chest and glaring at me with absolute venom. "How dare you show your face here?" Patricia hissed, her voice low but trembling with rage. "You were explicitly told to stay away from this family. This is an exclusive private corporate event, and you are entirely unwelcome." I looked at her with a cold, detached expression. I did not raise my voice. I simply let her unravel. "I am not here to attend your party, Patricia," I stated calmly. "I am here in my professional capacity." Patricia let out a harsh, mocking laugh, attempting to draw the attention of the surrounding guests, to humiliate me. "Professional capacity," she mocked loudly, ensuring her wealthy friends could hear her. "Do not make me laugh, Vanessa. You are nothing but a jealous, bitter woman who cannot stand to see her sister succeed. You tried to destroy Brittany's business because you have absolutely nothing going on in your own pathetic life. You are a complete disgrace to this family, and I will not allow you to ruin this beautiful evening with your toxic jealousy." She turned around and aggressively signaled for the country club security guards who were stationed near the exit. "Security," she yelled, her voice echoing over the string quartet. "I need this woman and her companions escorted off the property immediately. They are crashing a private event and harassing the host." The country club security guards immediately began walking toward us, their hands resting on their radios. The music abruptly stopped. The entire ballroom fell into a dead, shocked silence. Over 200 wealthy guests turned to watch the confrontation. Investors, clients, and socialites stared in disbelief as the matriarch of the family publicly screamed at her own daughter. Brittany and Richard rushed over to stand behind Patricia, forming a united front. Brittany crossed her arms, glaring at me with absolute hatred. "I told everyone you were insane," Brittany announced loudly, playing the victim for her audience. "I knew you would try to pull a stunt like this just to get attention. You need serious psychiatric help, Vanessa. Leave my gala right now before I have you arrested for trespassing." I stood perfectly still, letting their insults wash over me without a single reaction. I did not defend myself. I did not argue. I simply looked at the two country club security guards who had just arrived at our side. The guards looked hesitant, unsure of how to handle a dispute between wealthy family members. I turned to Agent Miller, who stepped forward smoothly, blocking the country club guards from advancing any further. Agent Miller reached inside his dark suit jacket and pulled out his official federal credentials, holding them up for the country club security team to clearly see. "You do not have the jurisdiction to remove us from this venue," Agent Miller stated in a booming, authoritative voice that carried to the very back of the silent ballroom. "This is now an active federal recovery zone." The country club security guards immediately backed away, raising their hands in compliance, retreating toward the perimeter of the dance floor. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy onlookers. Patricia gasped, clutching her diamond necklace as the harsh realization hit her. Richard's face turned a sickly shade of gray, his scotch spilling onto his shoes. Brittany's arrogant posture completely collapsed, her shoulders slumping in terror. I looked at her, maintaining steady, unbreakable eye contact, letting the heavy silence amplify her absolute dread. "I told you I removed my name from every loan tomorrow," I said, my voice slicing through the quiet room, carrying absolute finality. "Tomorrow is here, Patricia, and I brought the bank with me." Agent Miller stepped past Patricia and moved directly to the center of the dance floor. He did not need a microphone. His voice commanded absolute authority, carrying effortlessly over the heads of the stunned crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Miller announced clearly, "I am executing a federal asset seizure and commercial recovery order on behalf of First National Bank and the United States government. The business entity hosting this event is currently in catastrophic default. The funds used to secure this venue and purchase these assets were obtained through severe financial fraud." The entire ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and angry whispers. The wealthy investors who had just been praising Brittany suddenly backed away from her, as if she were carrying a contagious disease. A prominent real estate developer, who had been considering a massive contract with her event planning company, slammed his champagne glass onto a nearby table. He pointed a rigid finger directly at Richard, demanding to know where his preliminary investment capital had gone. Richard opened his mouth, but the words died in his throat. He looked around the room frantically, searching for a friendly face, but found only absolute disgust. The local politicians he had been bragging to just moments ago were already walking briskly toward the exit, desperate to distance themselves from a federal financial scandal. Agent Miller signaled to the back of the ballroom. 4 additional recovery agents wearing dark tactical suits walked through the heavy oak doors. They carried thick stacks of legal notices and heavy-duty asset tagging equipment. Agent Miller informed the crowd that every single physical asset inside the ballroom currently belonged to the bank. He stated that the floral arrangements, the custom lounge furniture, the lighting rigs, and even the massive ice sculpture were officially seized property. He advised the guests to step away from the tables so his team could begin the formal inventory process. Brittany watched the recovery agents march into her perfect gala. Her silver beaded gown suddenly looked ridiculous against the backdrop of her impending federal indictment. The illusion of her grand empire was shattering in real time, right in front of the very people she had spent years trying to impress. She let out a piercing guttural scream. It was not a cry of sadness. It was a raw, violent tantrum of a spoiled child who had finally been told no. Brittany spun around and aggressively shoved Richard in the chest. She did not care that 200 people were watching her complete mental collapse. She pointed at her father, her face twisted with pure, unadulterated rage. "This is all your fault!" Brittany screamed at the top of her lungs. "You told me the offshore accounts were completely untraceable. You said the predatory loan would fix the bank default before anyone noticed. You made me forge her signature on those federal tax returns. You ruined my business. You ruined my life." The crowd murmured in absolute shock. Brittany had just publicly confessed to federal tax fraud and identity theft in a room full of potential witnesses and federal agents. David stood next to me furiously, taking notes on his legal pad, capturing every single self-incriminating word she shouted. Agent Miller simply crossed his arms, watching the criminal conspiracy unravel itself without him having to ask a single question. Richard reached out, trying to grab Brittany's arm to silence her, but she violently slapped his hand away. She turned her rage onto Patricia. "And you?" Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You told me we could use Vanessa forever. You said she was just a pathetic, naive loser who would never fight back. You pushed me to throw this stupid party to save your own social reputation. You are both completely useless." Patricia looked as though she had been physically struck. The golden child she had worshipped and protected for 30 years had just thrown her directly under the bus to save her own skin. Patricia looked at the disgusted faces of her country club friends. She saw the absolute contempt in their eyes. The social status she valued above her own daughter's well-being was permanently obliterated. She had absolutely nothing left. Patricia collapsed onto her knees right there on the polished hardwood dance floor. She ignored the recovery agents who were already placing bright yellow seizure tags on the expensive floral centerpieces. She crawled across the floor toward me, grabbing the hem of my emerald green dress with shaking, desperate hands. "Vanessa, please!" Patricia sobbed uncontrollably, mascara running down her cheeks in dark, thick streaks. "Please, you have to stop them. They are going to take the house. They are going to take everything we own. We will have absolutely nowhere to go. We will be homeless. You cannot do this to your own family. I am your mother. I carried you. I raised you. Please, Vanessa, I am begging you to call the bank and fix this." I looked down at the woman kneeling at my feet. For 33 years I had craved her affection. I had worked myself to the bone trying to earn a single word of genuine praise. I had allowed her to belittle my career, mock my appearance, and treat my life as a joke. I had stood in a high-end steakhouse and watched her laugh until she cried while my nephew destroyed my graduation cake. I felt absolutely nothing for her. The well of my empathy was completely dry. I slowly pulled the fabric of my dress out of her grasping hands. I stepped back, creating a firm physical boundary between my peaceful existence and her chaotic destruction. I looked across the ballroom. The recovery agents were currently dismantling the pristine dessert table. They were carefully removing the expensive silver platters and stacking the gourmet pastries into boxes. The elaborate display of wealth was being packed away into cold cardboard evidence containers. I looked back down at Patricia. She was staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for the compliance she had always demanded and received. She expected me to break. She assumed my lifelong conditioning to be the family peacekeeper would ultimately override my desire for justice. I am not doing anything to you, Patricia. I stated, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of warmth. You forged my signature on federal documents to steal money. You defaulted on $1 million of commercial debt to fund your luxury vacations. You orchestrated your own downfall with breathtaking arrogance. The people standing in this room are not here because of me. They are here because of your profound greed. Patricia let out a loud, agonizing wail, burying her face in her hands. But we are going to be on the street, Vanessa. Where are we supposed to go? You have to help us. I tilted my head slightly, studying her desperate, weeping form. I thought about the cruel text message she had sent to the family group chat just days ago. I remembered the exact wording she had used to banish me from the family when she thought she held all the power. I recalled how Brittany had placed a red heart on that message, celebrating my permanent exclusion. You told me to stay away forever, I said, delivering the words with surgical precision. I am just honoring your request. Patricia let out a sharp gasp, her head snapping up to look at me. The absolute finality of my statement struck her like a physical blow. She realized in that exact moment that the obedient scapegoat was gone forever. There was no forgiveness coming. There was no financial rescue. There was only the cold, hard reality of the consequences she had earned. David stepped forward, opening his thick leather briefcase. He pulled out the final release of liability documents. These were the official legal forms acknowledging that my withdrawal as guarantor was complete, and that I held absolutely zero financial responsibility for the seized assets or the outstanding debt. He handed me his heavy fountain pen. I did not hesitate. I signed my full legal name on the bottom line of the document. The signature was fluid, continuous, and perfectly authentic. It was the complete opposite of the clumsy, panicked forgery they had submitted to the federal government. I handed the pen back to David. He placed the signed documents into his briefcase, snapping the locks shut with a loud, satisfying click. We are finished here, Vanessa, David said, offering a polite, professional nod. The bank has everything they need, and the federal agents will take over the criminal indictments. I turned away from my mother, who was still sobbing on the ballroom floor. I walked past Richard, who was currently being questioned by Agent Miller regarding the domestic shell companies. I walked past Brittany, who was screaming at a recovery agent for placing a yellow seizure tag on her custom velvet lounge chair. I did not look back at any of them. I walked through the heavy oak doors of the Oakbrook Country Club and stepped out into the cool evening air. The night sky was clear and filled with bright stars. The chaotic noise of the ruined gala faded away behind me, replaced by the peaceful sound of the wind rustling through the manicured trees. I reached my car and unlocked the doors. I sat in the driver's seat, taking a deep, slow breath. The heavy, invisible chains that had bound me to their toxic world were finally broken. I started the engine and drove away, leaving the ruins of their fake empire far behind me. I drove through the quiet suburban streets, leaving the Oakbrook Country Club far behind me. The cool night air flowing through my open windows felt like a physical cleansing. For the first time in my 33 years, I was driving home to a life that belonged entirely to me. I did not check my phone. I did not worry about the frantic text messages or the desperate voicemails that were undoubtedly flooding my inbox. The heavy, suffocating burden of managing my family and their toxic demands had been permanently lifted from my shoulders. When I arrived back at my apartment, I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and stood by the window watching the city lights. I knew that tomorrow the real consequences of their actions would become public knowledge, but tonight I simply enjoyed the absolute silence. The following weeks unfolded with brutal mechanical efficiency. First National Bank did not waste a single moment. With the asset seizure complete and the default officially registered, the bank initiated formal foreclosure proceedings on Brittany's massive 5-bedroom suburban home. Brittany fought the eviction tooth and nail, screaming at the bank representatives and threatening frivolous lawsuits. But without my pristine credit acting as a shield, she had absolutely zero legal standing. 30 days later, the county sheriff arrived at her property to enforce the eviction mandate. Brittany was forced to pack her designer clothes into garbage bags and vacate the premises, while her former neighbors watched from their perfectly manicured lawns. The Golden Child facade was utterly and permanently destroyed. She had to move into a tiny 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of the city, a space she could barely afford working a low-level administrative job. Patricia suffered an equally devastating social and financial collapse. The country club immediately revoked her membership, citing the public disturbance and the pending federal fraud investigations. Her wealthy friends, the same women she had spent decades trying to impress, completely abandoned her. Nobody wanted to be associated with a family facing federal tax evasion charges. Patricia was forced to sell her luxury vehicles and pawn her expensive jewelry just to keep food on the table. With Richard's assets entirely frozen by the government, Patricia had to do the one thing she considered the ultimate humiliation. She had to find a minimum wage job. The woman who used to mock my career and call me a failure was now working the cash register at a local discount retail store. Richard's fate was handled entirely by the United States justice system. The Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service built an airtight case using the encrypted flash drives and the forensic documentation I had provided. They traced every single dollar he had funneled through the domestic shell companies and into the offshore holding accounts. Because the evidence was so overwhelming, Richard did not even attempt to take the case to trial. He accepted a plea deal to avoid the maximum sentencing guidelines. He pleaded guilty to aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and federal tax evasion. He was sentenced to 84 months in a federal correctional facility. The arrogant bully who had tried to intimidate me in my parking garage was now wearing a standard-issue prison uniform, stripped of his wealth, his power, and his freedom. Throughout this entire catastrophic fallout, my own life remained completely untouched by the destruction. Because I had proactively removed my name from the loans, initiated a hard credit freeze, and voluntarily surrendered the evidence to the federal authorities, the banks and the government officially cleared me of any wrongdoing. My credit score remained absolutely pristine. The fraud investigators at First National Bank actually sent a formal letter of commendation to my attorney, David, praising my meticulous record-keeping and my total cooperation. With my financial foundation secure and my mental health completely restored, I realized I no longer wanted to work for a large corporate accounting firm. The ordeal with my family had ignited a deep passion for investigating financial crimes and exposing corporate fraud. I wanted to use my skills to help other people who were being exploited by manipulative entities. 3 months after the country club gala, I formally submitted my resignation to my corporate employer. I took my substantial savings and signed a commercial lease on a beautiful light-filled office space right in the heart of the financial district. I opened my own independent firm, specializing exclusively in forensic accounting and financial fraud recovery. My business grew faster than I could have ever anticipated. The corporate community in the city had heard whispers about the brilliant accountant who had flawlessly dismantled a $1 million money laundering operation. Wealthy clients and high-profile law firms actively sought out my services. They knew that if I possessed the sheer professional ruthlessness to audit and expose my own corrupt family, I would pursue their financial adversaries with the exact same relentless determination. Within 6 months, I had to hire 2 junior accountants and a full-time administrative assistant just to keep up with the massive influx of new contracts. My days were no longer filled with anxiety and emotional manipulation. I woke up every morning eager to go to my office. I spent my hours tracing hidden assets, exposing fraudulent ledgers, and testifying as an expert witness in complex civil litigation cases. I was highly respected, heavily compensated, and completely independent. I never heard from my family again. The strict legal directives David had filed remained firmly in place, and the stark reality of their new impoverished lives kept them far away from my professional sphere. Exactly 1 year after the disastrous graduation dinner at the steakhouse, I decided to throw a celebration. It was not a party to impress strangers or project a fake image of wealth. It was a genuine, intimate gathering to celebrate the 1 year anniversary of my forensic accounting firm and the vibrant, beautiful life I had built for myself. I rented out a private dining room at a lovely upscale restaurant overlooking the city skyline. The room was decorated with simple, elegant floral arrangements and soft ambient lighting. I did not invite anyone out of obligation. I only invited the people who had actively supported me, protected me, and helped me achieve my absolute freedom. David sat at the head of the table, raising a glass of premium champagne and smiling warmly. My former corporate mentor, who had guided me through my early career, sat next to him, sharing stories and laughing genuinely. My new junior accountants and my dedicated assistant were there, talking excitedly about our upcoming quarterly projections. I looked around the room and realized that this was my actual family. These were the people who valued my intelligence, respected my boundaries, and celebrated my success without a single ounce of jealousy or resentment. As the dinner concluded, the main doors of the private dining room opened. A young waiter walked in carrying a large silver tray. The room fell into a happy, comfortable silence as he approached the head of the table. He gently placed the tray down right in front of me. Sitting on the silver platter was a massive 3-tier vanilla bean cake. It was covered in flawless, smooth white fondant and decorated with delicate gold accents. On the very top of the cake sat a perfectly crafted fondant calculator and a tiny edible diploma. It was an exact replica of the graduation cake my nephew had destroyed 1 year ago. My staff had secretly contacted the original premium bakery and commissioned the replica to surprise me. I looked down at the beautiful, undamaged masterpiece. I did not feel a single pang of sadness or regret about the past. I only felt an overwhelming, profound sense of victory. The toxic people who had tried to force me to eat off the ground were completely gone, erased from my reality by their own staggering arrogance. David raised his champagne glass high into the air. He looked at me, his eyes shining with profound professional and personal pride. To Vanessa, he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet dining room. To the most brilliant forensic accountant in the city, and to the absolute unbreakable power of a woman who knows her own worth. The entire table raised their glasses and echoed the toast, cheering loudly and clapping their hands. I smiled, a deep, genuine smile that radiated through my entire body. I picked up the silver cake knife resting beside the tray. I carefully sliced through the pristine white fondant and served myself the very first perfect piece. I took a bite, savoring the sweet, rich vanilla flavor. The texture was incredibly light, and the taste was absolutely magnificent. It tasted exactly like absolute freedom. The long journey from being a discarded scapegoat to becoming a completely self-reliant business owner was finally over. I had built an untouchable empire from the ground up, and nobody would ever diminish my value again. 6 months later, I stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the Chicago skyline, holding a cup of coffee in my hands. The city below was moving exactly as it always had. Cars rushed through crowded streets. People walked quickly between towering buildings. Everyone was chasing something: a dream, a deadline, a better future. But for the first time in my entire life, I was not carrying someone else's burden. I was only responsible for myself. The investigation into my family's financial crimes had moved faster than anyone expected. Once federal agents uncovered the full scope of the fraudulent transactions, the fake consulting companies, and the forged documents, there was no way for Richard and Brittany to escape the consequences. The luxurious lifestyle they had spent years protecting was nothing more than an illusion built on debt, deception, and my willingness to keep saving them. The 5-bedroom suburban house was eventually sold during the legal proceedings. The designer clothes, expensive vehicles, and unnecessary luxury purchases that once represented their success were gone. The event planning company that Brittany had proudly displayed on social media disappeared completely. For years, she had convinced everyone around her that she was a powerful entrepreneur who built an incredible empire. But when my signature disappeared from her foundation, the entire structure collapsed overnight. The strangest part was that I did not feel happiness watching them lose everything. I expected to feel revenge. I expected some powerful sense of victory, but I didn't. What I felt was something much quieter: peace. I finally understood that revenge was never the thing I was truly searching for. What I wanted was freedom. Freedom from the constant pressure to prove myself. Freedom from the endless responsibility of fixing problems I did not create. Freedom from the belief that I needed my family's approval to know my own worth. For 33 years, I had been trying to earn love from people who had already decided they would never give it freely. And that realization was painful. But it was also the most liberating truth I had ever discovered. A few weeks after everything ended, my mother attempted to contact me one final time through David's office. She did not apologize for the years of emotional abuse. She did not apologize for laughing when Mason destroyed my graduation cake. Instead, she asked if there was any possibility I could help them negotiate with prosecutors. She still saw me as the person who could solve their problems, the person who would sacrifice herself so everyone else could avoid consequences. But that person no longer existed. I politely declined, not because I hated them, because I finally respected myself. My career also changed in ways I never imagined. The experience with my own family reminded me why I became a forensic accountant in the first place. Numbers tell stories. Financial records reveal truths that people try desperately to hide. I started taking on more complex corporate investigations. I helped companies uncover fraud, protect their assets, and identify dishonest practices before they caused irreversible damage. The same skills my family underestimated became the very skills that built my future. The quiet daughter they ignored became the professional people trusted. The person they considered weak became the person who could see through every lie. One evening, I returned to the same steakhouse where everything had started. I sat at the same table near the window. The restaurant looked exactly the same. The dark wooden walls, the elegant lighting, the quiet music playing in the background. But I was different. I ordered dessert, a simple slice of vanilla cake, not because I was trying to recreate the past, because I wanted to create a new memory. I took a small bite and smiled. That cake was no longer a symbol of humiliation. It was a reminder that someone can try to destroy your celebration, but they cannot destroy your achievements. Someone can laugh at your success, but they cannot erase your hard work. Someone can tell you that you are not valuable, but they cannot change the truth. Your worth was never determined by the people who failed to recognize it. The biggest lesson I learned was that boundaries are not cruelty. Walking away from people who repeatedly hurt you is not betrayal. Choosing yourself after years of being chosen last is not selfish, it is survival. For a long time, I believed family meant accepting everything no matter how much it hurt. I believed loyalty meant staying silent. I believed love meant constantly proving that I deserved a place at the table. But I finally learned that real love does not require you to destroy yourself. The people who truly care about you will not celebrate your pain. They will not use your kindness as a weakness. They will not demand sacrifices while giving nothing in return. Today, my life is peaceful. My apartment is quiet. My mornings belong to me. My achievements belong to me. And for the first time, I wake up every day without wondering what crisis I need to fix for someone else. I lost a family that only valued what I could provide. But I gained something far more important. I gained myself. And sometimes walking away from people who refuse to see your worth is not the end of your story. It is the moment your real story finally begins.